The desert heat shimmered above the firing range at 29 Palms, waves of dust rising with every step of the Marines lined along the shooting lanes. The clang of steel targets echoed in the distance, a steady rhythm of confidence and youth. Near the far end, a lone woman adjusted a scope on a borrowed rifle, her movements deliberate and quiet. She looked out of place among the tan uniforms and loud laughter. Mid-30s, calm eyes, sleeves rolled neatly, not a trace of arrogance. The young Marines traded grins, watching her work in silence that quickly turned into whispers. "That's not how you zero a scope, ma'am," one said, half joking, half patronizing. Another added with a smirk, "She's going to shoot the sand, not the target." The sergeant in charge didn't stop them. He just laughed under his breath, assuming she was some civilian contractor with more theory than aim. None of them knew her name, Staff Sergeant Elena Cross, or what it once meant on battlefields half a world away. She didn't argue. She only looked up, steady and unreadable. When she finally pulled the trigger, silence fell, and the Marines realized just who they'd been laughing at. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The desert wind carried the faint tang of gunpowder as Elena Cross adjusted the tripod beneath the borrowed rifle. Her fingers moved with quiet precision, each turn of the dial controlled, practiced, almost gentle. She wore no uniform, just khaki cargo pants and a light tactical shirt rolled at the sleeves. No insignia, no patches, nothing to reveal who she once was. To the young Marines around her, she was just a contractor, another civilian with a clipboard and a laptop, here to test numbers they didn't care about. At 34, she had the stillness of someone who had seen enough chaos to value silence. Her brown hair was tied neatly into a low braid that brushed the back of her collar. The sun burned against the side of her face, but she didn't squint. She'd faced worse heat before, Afghan heat, the kind that made the air shimmer and the ground ache. "Ma'am, careful with that one," a corporal said politely, though the smirk that followed gave him away. "That's not a demo piece, that's real steel." Elena just nodded, resting the rifle on the sandbag. "I know," she said softly. Her voice was steady, carrying a tone of respect that made the corporal hesitate, but only for a second. They thought she was a technician, the kind who talked about trajectories and algorithms. The woman who explained bullet drop using formulas instead of fieldwork. She didn't correct them. She'd been working for the Corps as a civilian contractor for nearly 2 years, calibrating new ballistic software used for training snipers. The irony never escaped her. She once was one. Before her discharge, Staff Sergeant Elena Cross had been one of the most trusted long-range marksmen in Task Force Anvil, a joint Army-Marine unit in southern Afghanistan. She and her spotter, Sergeant Marcus Hale, had logged dozens of confirmed hits during missions that never made the news. They'd been ghosts on the ridgelines, unseen, uncelebrated, but always there when the infantry called for eyes. Then came Helmand Province. Her flashbacks always began the same way, the sound of Hale's voice crackling through the comms, the sandstorm rising like smoke, and a convoy trapped in the open. She remembered calculating distance through dust, the target blurred by wind and fear. One shot, one heartbeat, one decision. The shot hit true. The convoy survived, and then the ground erupted. The blast tore through their position, shredding everything but her will to keep breathing. Hale was gone before she could reach him. When the medics pulled her out, the scope was still clutched in her hands, cracked but intact. She never picked up a rifle again, not as a soldier. The Corps had offered her a contractor role when she refused to re-enlist after recovery. "Teach others what you know," they said. She accepted, not out of ambition but obligation. Someone had to get the numbers right so the next Hale might live. Now she spent her days on firing ranges, quietly testing the accuracy of software that predicted bullet paths at long distances. The Marines treated her well enough, polite but distant, like a math teacher invited to a boxing match. They didn't mean disrespect, they just didn't understand. That morning, as she set up her sensors and checked wind readings, She overheard the same tone she'd heard 100 times before, that subtle doubt in their laughter. "Ma'am, you sure you want to use that old M200? The scope's probably older than me." She looked up briefly, meeting the Marine's grin with a calm that unnerved him. "Older rifles have steadier souls," she said. He blinked, unsure if she was joking. Another Marine whispered, "Bet she's one of those analysts from Quantico, probably never fired a live round." Elena heard it, but didn't react. The old her might have corrected them. The new her just breathed. In truth, she'd been dreading this trip to 29 Palms. Too many memories of sand and mirage, too much heat that smelled like Helmand. But she'd come because the new system needed real-world verification. High-range wind shear, long sightlines, open desert. She wasn't there to prove a point. Just data, just numbers. Still, the way they watched her stirred something buried deep. Not pride, not anger, but the quiet ache of someone erased by time. They didn't know her record. They didn't know her scars. To them, she was the data lady. She straightened, glancing across the lanes where Marines fired in perfect rhythm, the thunder of rifles echoing off the berm. She noticed everything. The misalignment of a stance, the overcorrection of a trigger pull, the momentary hesitation before the breath. She could have fixed each one with a few words, but she stayed silent. She wasn't here to teach. Still, her instincts never slept. Every time a shot cracked, her eyes traced its invisible arc, following it all the way to the target. Her brain calculated wind, drag, drop. She couldn't help it. It was who she was. The sergeant leading the session, Gunnery Sergeant Mason, passed behind her with a half smile. "Ma'am, careful not to show these boys up," he joked, not realizing the truth in his words. Elena returned the smile faintly. "Wouldn't dream of it, Gunny." But inside, she felt the old rhythm stirring, the math of distance, the poetry of precision, the ghost of hail whispering corrections in the back of her mind. A gust of wind passed across the range, shifting the mirage. She looked through the scope, adjusting the focus slightly. The reticle floated over a far target, a steel plate glinting in the sun. She exhaled. The numbers aligned. Then she blinked, pulling away. No, not today. She wasn't here for that. Her job was to record wind data, run calibration software, and sign off the test results. That's all. The Marines could have their laughter. She'd earned her silence. Still, a part of her missed the sound of a confirmed hit. The metallic ping that meant lives saved. The faint satisfaction of knowing your purpose mattered, not to fame, but to the men who came home alive because of your aim. That part of her was buried deep, behind the same quiet calm she wore now like armor. She lifted her notebook and checked the readings. The software had a margin error. She needed to retest. As she recalibrated the sensors, she heard one Marine whisper, "Wonder if she even knows how to hold that rifle." Elena didn't turn. She smiled faintly, writing down the temperature, 98 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind, 8 knots, southwest cross. Just numbers. But behind her eyes, another image flickered. The valley in Helmand, the crosswinds shifting, the shot that mattered most, and a promise whispered into dust, "I'll never take another shot unless I have to." She didn't know that before the day ended, she'd break that promise, and every Marine on that range would remember her name forever. The shot cracked across the desert and echoed into the hills, wide, off target by a clean 3 inches. Exactly where Elena meant it to go. She made a small note on her tablet, eyes never leaving the scope. It was just calibration, a controlled drift test. Nothing more. Behind her, boots shuffled, and laughter began to bubble like heat off asphalt. "Don't worry, ma'am," a Marine called out, his voice half friendly, half taunting. "We'll teach you how to shoot." The words landed softly, but the laughter that followed hit harder. Another joined in. "You can't just point and pray. This ain't church." Elena said nothing. She ejected the casing, logged the data, adjusted windage by a 1/4 mil, and sent another round exactly where she wanted, wrong again, but consistently so. The same Marine whistled low. 2 for 2, boys. Maybe she's painting the desert." More laughter. A corporal a few lanes down decided to make a show of it. He turned sideways, mimicking her calm stance, chin lifted, finger pressed dramatically against an invisible trigger. "Observe, gentlemen," he announced, "the rare civilian sniper, native to office chairs and spreadsheets." The Marines howled. Even Gunnery Sergeant Mason chuckled as he passed behind her, arms folded across his chest. He didn't stop them. On a range like this, everyone got tested somehow. Elena barely blinked. She wrote down another measurement and reset her rifle. A younger private leaned toward the corporal. "She's not going to say anything? Why would she?" the corporal replied. "She's too busy missing on purpose." The next shot landed slightly left, her third test. Another line on her data sheet. But the laughter swelled again, sharper this time, pushing closer to mockery than humor. "Guess she's scared of noise," someone said. "All that talk about calibrations means she's scared to actually hit something." Elena's voice cut quietly through the chatter. "Just waiting for the wind to decide if it wants to help." The tone wasn't defensive. It was matter-of-fact, even kind. Yet the words carried an edge that made a few heads turn. One of the older sergeants nearby frowned, the way someone does when they've heard a familiar dialect. He knew that phrasing. That was sniper talk. But the younger Marines missed the cue. "Oh, the wind's fault," the corporal said, grinning wide. "Didn't realize the breeze took requests." More laughter, though quieter now, uneasy around the edges. Something about her stillness unsettled them. Elena kept working. Each movement was exact, cycling the bolt, checking mirage, jotting notes. She didn't fire fast. She didn't hurry. That calm, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself, was the one thing no training manual could teach. Minutes stretched. Her lane became a small island of silence amid the noise. The Marines, losing steam, started whispering, "What's she even doing? She hasn't hit the target once. Maybe the system's glitched." Then came the check. Downrange, a signal flag rose. The spotter's report came through the radio. "Lane 7, no scoring hits." "Papers clean." That brought the laughter roaring back. "Guess that answers it," the corporal shouted. "She's allergic to steel." The others chuckled again, though not all of them. The older ones had stopped. They were watching too carefully, noticing details the rest ignored: her trigger discipline, her breathing rhythm, the subtle way she accounted for mirage without touching her weather meter. She wasn't random. She was deliberate. "Hey, Gunny," the corporal called out, "should we get her a Nerf gun?" Even Mason smirked. "Let her run it. The desert humbles everyone eventually." Elena lifted her head, eyes cool under the brim of her cap. "You're not wrong, Gunny," she said evenly. "The desert teaches respect. Usually the hard way." The corporal opened his mouth, but the word stuck halfway out. For a heartbeat, he saw something in her gaze, something older than rank or gender or uniform. She turned back to the scope, ending the moment. The next few shots were silent rituals. Adjust, breathe, fire, record. Her notebook filled with measured calm. Then Mason's voice came through the mic again. "Lane 7, you planning to hit anything today?" Elena keyed her mic. "Negative, Gunny. Tracking lens drift under heat expansion." There was a pause. Then a low chuckle. "Copy that, scientist." Another wave of laughter rolled behind her. She ignored it. The corporal leaned to his buddy. "Lens drift, huh? That what they call missing now? Maybe she's writing a novel," another whispered. The jokes landed softer now, but the sting was there. The private who'd laughed earlier looked down at his boots, unsure. He glanced at her again, at the quiet focus, the faint scar running along her forearm, the way her breathing synced with the rhythm of the flag's downrange. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but something told him not to laugh again. Elena paused between shots, feeling the dry wind slide over her skin like memory. Hellman flashed in her mind, the smell of burning sandbags, the ring in her ears after the blast, Hale's hand slipping away. She blinked, and the California sun returned. She exhaled through her nose and whispered to herself, "Stay with the wind." "Ma'am," the corporal called, sensing weakness. "You trying to talk it into helping you?" Elena smiled faintly, still behind the scope. Sometimes it listens. A few Marines chuckled. The older sergeant nearby crossed his arms, his face unreadable. He'd seen that calm before, in Afghanistan maybe, or Iraq. Men and women who didn't need to raise their voices because they'd already heard the loudest noises the world could make. "Target check again," the tower called out. "Lane 7, still clean." "What's the issue?" Elena responded, soft and professional. "Recording drift pattern, 10 more rounds." The corporal muttered under his breath. "She's wasting ammo." Elena's pencil paused over her notebook. "Not wasted," she said quietly. "Just measured." The corporal blinked. He hadn't realized she'd heard him. "Hey," Mason said, strolling back. "You got enough data yet?" She looked up at him and offered a small, steady nod. "Almost." "Good," he said with a grin. "Maybe we'll get to see a hit before sundown." She returned the smile, polite, then turned back to her work. The Marines exchanged looks, some amused, some impatient, one or two now uncomfortable. The laughter that once filled the range had thinned into pockets of silence. When people laugh long enough without a reaction, they start to wonder what they're missing. Elena fired again. The casing bounced against the bench. The corporal shook his head. Still nothing. "I don't get it. What's she even proving?" One of the older Marines answered quietly. "Maybe she doesn't need to prove anything." But the corporal didn't catch the warning. "If she was any good, she'd show us." Elena didn't rise to it. She finished the string, set the rifle down gently, and began packing her notes. Then the tower's voice echoed again, louder this time. "Range control to lane 7. All marks cold. Confirm no live rounds before reset." "Confirmed," Elena replied. As she stood, the corporal gave a mock bow. "Appreciate the demonstration, ma'am." Real inspiring. Elena met his grin with quiet composure. "You're welcome," she said. "But you might want to re-zero your own rifle before you start lessons." That made a few Marines snort softly. The corporal's smile faltered. She turned back toward her bench and began checking her scope mounts. The sun was lowering, shadows stretching long across the range. The wind had settled, a steady 7-knot cross. Predictable. Perfect, she closed her notebook. The calibration was done. The optic was drifting, but her patience had held. Then came the final push. The corporal, stung by her calm, tried to reclaim the crowd. "So, what's the excuse now? Gonna blame the sand?" Elena looked at him, eyes clear and steady. "No excuses. Just physics." "Physics doesn't hit targets," he shot back. "No," she said softly. "People do. When they stop talking long enough to listen." For the first time, the laughter didn't come. The desert grew still, the sound of distant ricochets fading. Even Mason glanced at her with a half-smile, like he'd just remembered something from long ago. Elena sat back down, sliding behind the rifle once more, not for data, not for show. Just to confirm her calibration. She centered the reticle, adjusted 0.5 mil for drift, and squeezed. The metallic ping rolled across the valley. No one said a word. She chambered another round, took a breath, and sent the second shot. Another ping, perfect alignment. The corporal's jaw tightened. Lucky shots. Elena didn't reply. She fired a third, another direct hit. The wind carried the sound downrange, clean and crisp. 3 perfect strikes. She lifted her head, calm as ever. "Looks like the calibration's complete." Mason approached, rubbing his chin. "Those were good shots," he admitted, though his voice stayed casual. "Beginner's luck?" Elena's lips curved in a faint, knowing smile. "Luck doesn't group." It was then that the older Marine, the one who'd stopped laughing earlier, leaned forward. His eyes had caught the faint tattoo under her sleeve, the curve of a coiled serpent around a crosshair. He'd seen that emblem once before, long ago, painted on a rifle case from Task Force Anvil. But he said nothing yet. The corporal gave one last shrug. "All right, ma'am. Guess the wind finally decided to help." Elena stood, brushing dust from her hands. "It usually does," she said quietly. "If you've earned its respect." The corporal frowned, unsure if she was joking again. Mason called for a range reset, his tone lighter now but edged with curiosity. "All right, Marines, let's give the lady some room. We'll see who's laughing after the long-range run." As the group dispersed, Elena remained at her bench, jotting the final line in her notebook. Drift confirmed. Wind stabilized. Patience intact. She closed it, exhaled, and looked toward the horizon. The day wasn't over yet. The laughter had quieted, but the test wasn't done. And deep down, every Marine on that line, whether they admitted it or not, felt the same uneasy truth rising in their chest. Something about her didn't add up. Her silence had weight. Her eyes had memory. And the way she spoke about the wind, it wasn't theory. It was experience. What would you have done if you were there? Would you have spoken up, or stayed silent and watched? The laughter had burned itself out, leaving only the dry hum of wind sliding over the range. The sun was starting to fall lower, shadows stretching long across the sand. The Marines' earlier confidence had dimmed, replaced by a restless curiosity they didn't want to admit. Something about that woman's silence didn't sit right. Elena knelt beside her rifle, brushing sand from the receiver, the movement smooth and practiced. The sleeves of her shirt fell just short of her wrists. When she leaned forward, the fabric tugged slightly, revealing the faint curve of a tattoo, a coiled serpent wrapped around a crosshair. One of the older Marines, Sergeant Lewis, caught sight of it. The image froze him. He had seen that symbol before, years ago, during his first deployment in Helmand. It wasn't a random design, it was the mark of Task Force Anvil, a joint Army-Marine sniper detachment that had operated deep in enemy territory before being quietly disbanded. Legends said the unit's two-man teams could take out a convoy from over 2 miles away. He looked closer. The lines of the serpent weren't bold or decorative. They were faded, almost hidden under the tan of her skin, like something not meant for show. He frowned, his voice low. "That's impossible." "What?" the corporal beside him asked. "Nothing," Lewis muttered. But he didn't laugh anymore. Elena tightened the strap on her sling, her movements unhurried, deliberate. Each adjustment seemed measured to the millimeter, each pause exact. She didn't check her notes now, she didn't need to. Her fingers found the turret dial, spinning it with subtle confidence, counting clicks under her breath. Point 1, point 2, point 3, someone down the line whispered. "That's not from a manual." The corporal turned toward him. "What are you talking about?" "That count. That's how snipers fine-tune windage mid-shot. You don't do that unless you've done it for real." The corporal looked back at her, unsettled despite himself. Elena's hand hovered near the bolt, her thumb resting lightly on the safety. Her focus wasn't just on the target, it was on the invisible language of air. Her eyes tracked the distant shimmer of heat, the dancing of the mirage. She exhaled once, the slow, practiced release of someone who'd learned patience, not from training, but from survival. Downrange, the air changed. The wind picked up, swirling dust in faint spirals. The flags fluttered hard for a moment, then settled again. She adjusted her elevation. The way she did it made Lewis's throat tighten, not because of what she was doing, but how she was doing it. There was no hesitation, no calculation delay, no doubt. The kind of certainty that only comes from years of watching men live or die by milliradians. "Who is she?" whispered the Private Nolan. The corporal shook his head, voice quieter now. "Some kind of ballistics tech. That's what the schedule said." Lewis didn't respond. He just kept watching. Then Nolan noticed something else. On the side of her range bag, partially covered by dust and frayed webbing, a small metal tag glinted faintly in the sun. The letters were scratched, but still legible. Cross and Hale, 2004-21 confirmed. He frowned, leaning slightly. "What's that mean?" The corporal peered at it, squinting. Maybe it's a serial number, but Lewis knew better. His mouth went dry. Cross and Hale. He'd heard those names before, whispered during night shifts in the desert, spoken like myths. An Army-Marine sniper team that had operated together in Afghanistan. Rumor said they'd once held off an entire ambush from over 2 kilometers out, their shots saving a company pinned down near Sangin. The details were always fuzzy, but one number always came up, 2,421 meters. He looked at her again, at the steadiness, the quiet, the way her eyes followed the flags before the gusts reached them. He felt it in his bones. It couldn't be coincidence. She can't be, he started, then stopped himself. What? The corporal pressed. Lewis just shook his head. Forget it. But he couldn't. The wind gusted harder now, sending waves of dust curling across the range. The Marine squinted against the glare, but Elena didn't move. She stayed locked in, one hand on the scope, her cheek resting against the comb, her body perfectly still. A hush fell. No one was laughing anymore. Mason, who had been half listening to the chatter, noticed the change in tone. He walked closer, coffee cup forgotten in his hand. "Everything good down here?" he asked lightly, but no one answered. The corporal finally spoke. "She's recalibrating gunny, or something." Mason followed his gaze. Elena's hair shifted slightly in the wind, sunlight glinting off the faint scar that traced down the side of her temple. The way she moved, that steady precision, was unmistakable. He'd seen that same rhythm once before, in Kandahar, in the hands of people who didn't just shoot, they calculated, they read the earth. He took a step back, suddenly unsure. The silence deepened. The wind's low hum was the only sound, rattling the flagpoles and brushing through the brush. Elena adjusted the parallax knob, murmuring numbers softly. 3800, Mirage stable. Wind 8 knots cross. Lewis's stomach turned. 3800. That was the maximum test distance, nearly 2.5 miles. The range record no one had touched. "Gunny," Lewis said quietly, "you might want to see this." Mason frowned, but when he looked again at her stance, the smooth transition, the focus that didn't waver, his expression shifted, the amusement faded. Elena's sleeve brushed against her arm again, revealing the serpent tattoo more clearly now. The ink caught the sun, black against her tanned skin. "Task Force Anvil," Lewis whispered before he could stop himself. The corporal turned sharply. "What?" Lewis's jaw tightened. "It's an old sniper unit. Joint Task Force. Army and Marine Corps. Disbanded after Helmand. So, she's got their mark." The corporal blinked, then laughed weakly like he was trying to dismiss it. "No way!" "Those guys were ghosts." Lewis didn't laugh. "Exactly." The mood shifted completely. The same Marines who'd spent the afternoon joking now watched in uneasy silence. The corporal's grin had long vanished, replaced by a hesitant stare. Even Nolan stood still, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes fixed on her. The wind began to swirl heavier, kicking up grit that stung at their faces. The range flag snapped in rhythm. Elena didn't flinch. She watched the dust, reading it like a language, measuring every twist and pause. She whispered something, a prayer maybe, or a calculation. Then she reached down, sliding a new round into the chamber with slow reverence. Mason took another step closer, voice low. "Ma'am, what exactly are you testing?" Elena didn't look up, just seeing if the wind still remembers me. The gunnery sergeant hesitated, realizing he didn't understand, and maybe didn't want to. For the next minute, no one spoke. The hum of the desert filled the silence, a steady, ancient rhythm. Even the mockingbirds had gone quiet. When Elena lifted her head, her expression was unreadable. "Range control," she called calmly. "Request lane 7 clearance to engage extended plate." "Confirmed," the tower replied. "Target distance, 3800 meters." A murmur rippled down the line. Nobody laughed this time. As she set the rifle into position, the coiled serpent tattoo caught the last orange flare of sunset. The wind steadied. Dust hung in the air like a thin veil. No one knew her story yet. But everyone on that range suddenly felt the same thing, that whatever joke they'd been telling all afternoon was over. Because the way she knelt there, calm, patient, eyes fixed through the scope, didn't belong to a contractor or a scientist. It belonged to a sniper who'd seen the world through a crosshair and lived to remember what it cost. The long plate sat at the far edge of the range like a rumor, A tiny glint of steel 4 football fields and more away, half lost in heat and distance. All morning it had defeated every attempt. Experienced marksmen on the base had tried in pairs, swapping calibers and mags, trading equipment like talismans. The mirage danced across their scopes, and the wind braided itself into unpredictable threads. The range record for that plate had become a quiet dare. Everyone knew someone who tried. No one had claimed it. When the idea landed, the throwaway line from a bored corporal, it felt like a dare and a dismissal rolled into one. "Why not let the data lady try?" somebody said, laughing to ease the boredom. Gunnery Sergeant Mason grinned in the way men grin when they want to see a show. "Sure, Cross. Let's see what you've got." Elena felt the theater of it more than the insult. There are small humiliations that sting, and small humiliations that are useful. This was both. She could walk away. She had promised herself for years that she would not carry a rifle for applause or retribution. She'd taught others how to shoot, and kept the ghosts of the past measured in spreadsheets and algorithms. Today she had come to log wind profiles and confirm software. But the wind had a way of hushing a crowd when it wanted a different story. She set the M200 intervention on the sandbag like a relic. It was old by modern standards, not the newest chassis or the latest ballistic computing optic. But it was honest, a tool that had been loved and well kept. Her hands moved in practical motions. Check the chamber, sweep the bore, inspect the crown, confirm the bedding. She did not caress the muzzle like a relic. She acknowledged it like a colleague. "Range 3800, she said aloud, more to herself than the line. She keyed the throat mic clipped to her vest and reported the basics into the net. Temp 98. Barometric low at 900. Wind 8 knots, left to right, gusting to 12 near Mirage Column. Hold 0.5 left for drift, plus 2.5 mils elevation for drop. Expect supersonic transition delay at this distance. Time of flight approx 9 seconds. The words landed in the air among the Marines like stones. Some faces turned pale at the distance. Others squinted at the numbers like they were foreign language. The corporal who'd mocked her tightened his jaw the way men do when they realize a joke demanded accounting. "You sure about that?" Mason asked. Less a challenge now, and more a check. There were calculations that could be argued in briefings. This was not one of them. He'd been around long enough to know measurements that didn't match felt like the start of trouble. "I've run it on software across multiple atmospherics," Elena replied, "but this one's got the heat layers. I'll call it on Mirage and adjust if it stabilizes. Need quiet on the line when I go hot." There was a sudden, involuntary hush. The boys who had been trying on bravado felt it like a cooling. The range always responded to ceremony with reverence. This felt like that. Mason lifted a hand and motioned for the line to fall silent. Heads turned, boots shifted. Even the diesel hum in the background seemed to lean away. Elena settled into position. The stock sat into the webbing of her shoulder, as if it had always known her. Her cheek found the comb the way a pianist's fingers find the keys, not thinking, just knowing. She thumbed the safety, then engaged the tracking position. Her breath found the old cadence, inhale, settle, exhale to the shot. Her spotter, Nolan, the kid who'd offered her hotter rounds earlier, crouched opposite, binoculars tilted, notebook open. He was pale, not from sun, but from the sense of participating in something he hadn't earned. He met her eyes for a second and nodded. "Wind outward now," he said, voice steady. 7.5. She gave him a small squeeze of the hand that rested on the 4. This was a ritual between two people whose lives were counted in inches and seconds. It was not melodrama. It was mutual trust. She whispered, "On my call." The first shot was a test of the field more than of the rifle. Elena controlled the trigger the way she had controlled dozens of moments that mattered, with the entire body, not just the finger. The report was a distant bark, the supersonic crack somewhere between the bench and the berm. For a breath, the world seemed to hold. The sound of the shot was delayed by distance and by the room in their chests. Then, out there, a thin column of dust rose, shy of the plate. Murmurs swelled like a bruise. "Near miss," someone breathed. The corporal's smirk returned for a microsecond before the math on his face shut it down. She had expected 1 or 2 edge hits. Precision at that distance isn't about dramatic pings. It's about controlling variables and listening to what small plumes say to you. She logged the impact with cool fingers and recalculated. Nolan read the digits off to her. Impact 3 meters low, 0.3 right. He sounded like a man reading instructions for a machine. She nodded, adjusting turrets to compensate. Not furious, not triumphant. Just exact. Adjustment, confirmation, trust the equation. She threaded the bolt home and waited for the wind to speak again. The mirage in the midfield turned to slow rhythm, the flags lining up like a choir. The desert was settling into a sentence. She was learning how to read the punctuation. The second shot was closer. The dust plume kissed the steel rim and curled inward like an inquiry. Silence bunched around their throats. Nobody moved. There was an animal intelligence in the way the longer distances responded, a gossip among grains of sand and air. Elena felt it. She adjusted the hold, an almost invisible change, and found the last measure of patience that would matter. The third pull was not practice. It was the culmination of measurement and trust. Her finger compressed the sear with a precision that had been sculpted by years of necessity, not practice runs. In that tiny decision, her past and present met, the memory of Hale's calm voice, the bitter geometry of survival, the hard ledger of loss. The report rolled off her shoulder and out into the afternoon like a bell released. It fell through air that had nothing in it, and then everything. Layers of temperature, eddies and shears, a travel time that let an entire conversation live in the space between pull and impact. For 9 seconds the world could have ended, and no one on the line would have heard it, because the moment was owned by 2 people and a distance. Then the spotter at the berm shouted, voice breaking the hush, "Center impact." Center. Holy, it's clean. You could have heard a pin drop in the space that followed the shout. The distant steel sang a perfect, deniable note, and then, as if the valley had been waiting for permission, returned the sound to them. A thin, ringing note you only get when a target is kissed in the right spot. For a beat, no one moved. The laughter, the jokes, the nicotine relief, and the small bravado all vacated the men who had been joking earlier. Faces went slack. The corporal who'd mimicked her lost his posture, as if someone had told him his role was over. No one clapped. Applause is for measured theater, not for the sudden knowledge that the rules had been rewritten. Mason walked out from the line like a man stepping into an unknown room. "Cross," he said, the name more a question than an address. He could feel the old stories clicking into place behind his teeth. "You sure that was you?" Elena closed one eye and looked downrange beyond the dust. Nolan blew out a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding. "That was perfect," he said. His voice had the tremor of a new convert. A silence thickened until it was almost a presence. Even the sun seemed to hang differently. The older sergeant, Lewis, stared at her forearm where the serpent wound around the crosshair. He swallowed. Gradually, like men remembering songs they had only half known, others began to connect the dots, the tattoo, the way she counted wind clicks, the tag on her bag, the soft cadence of her command of numbers. You did that," the corporal finally said, disbelief and grudging respect mixing like iron in a cup. She shrugged as if shrugging off a cardigan. Range was as it said, mirage settled, wind averaged. The math worked. Her answer was infuriating in its simplicity. It made the men who had been so sure of themselves feel both small and oddly grateful. They had been taught a lesson without noticing their education. "Do you know what that shot does to a man?" Mason asked, not accusatory, but like someone who had stood too close to the blast to be unaffected. Elena's eyes softened, a vertical shift in meaning. For a fraction of a breath, the Helmand Valley unspooled in her memory, the tone of Hale's voice calling corrections, the smell of diesel and gun oil turned into a hymn. "It keeps people alive sometimes," she said. "That's the point." The spotter ran the data again, rapid and reverent. Time of flight confirmed. Grouping impossible at that distance without a perfect hold and compensation. We saw Mirage boil then settle. She timed it with the gust lull. That was more than a lucky string. A murmur rose, more than luck. It wrapped around the line like a banner. Men who had been joking hours earlier came forward now with different breath. One of them, who had only moments before suggested she use a Nerf gun, looked at her with the rawness of recognition. "Ma'am," he said, voice small, "who are you?" She looked at them. At the young faces newly sober, at the older ones who had seen too much, at Mason who had the authority to call a parade or a reprimand, and instead folded his hands, and for the first time that day she let the name out. "Elena Cross," she said, "Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army. I'm retired." The words landed like a salve and a shock. Some men breathed out in relief, some felt chagrined at having doubted. Nolan's mouth hung open like a man learning the sky can be broader than he was told. "But Cross," Mason said slowly, like a man working through a map he hadn't walked in years. "Cross as in cross and hail? The shot?" "You don't have to say it," Elena interrupted, not in anger but in care. The name hung between them, Hale, the partner who had taught her the language of ranges and then paid the cost with a life. The tag on her bag, the numbers scratched into metal, the faint tattoo, they were all markers of a life lived with another. A hush like a benediction rose. The men shifted, some to attention, most to a posture that was a near salute without a hand raised. Respect had been earned not by proclamation but by a small, nearly invisible act that required nothing but the truth of practice. Nolan stepped forward, hand outstretched like a supplicant. "Sir," he said to Mason, then to Elena, I had no idea." Mason reached out and clapped him on the shoulder, the gesture both reassurance and a sign of welcome into a new thought. "Neither did any of us," Mason admitted. "But we do now." The lineup reformed, not with the swagger of earlier, but with the steady gait of men who'd watched someone unmake a joke and replace it with something that mattered. They asked questions in a different tone, technical this time, not mocking. "What was the hold you used? How did you compensate for the shear layer? You trust the M200 at that range?" Elena answered each with patient practicality, not to prove herself, but to teach. She let every question be a doorway rather than a duel. She spoke of cadence and patience, of reading mirage instead of forcing it, of listening to wind flags like voices. She talked about calculation and grief with the same soft authority. Her explanations stitched curiosity to humility. When the sun dipped low and the berms turned to shadow, the line dissolved in small clusters, trades of ammo and theory, not mockery. The corporal who had mimed her shook his head and laughed, a small, embarrassed sound. He walked over and offered her a cigarette, a peace offering wrapped in awkwardness. She declined with a smile, accepting something similar, the tacit promise that stories deserved the truth. As they packed up, the range had shifted. What had begun as a morning of cheap jokes ended with a quiet that held weight. The plate at 3,800 meters had been scored, and in the space between the shots and the impact, something else had been measured. The thin, stubborn line that runs from doubt to respect. ChatGPT said, Mason came down the firing line fast, boots kicking dust, the air around him still vibrating with the echo of that impossible shot. His coffee cup was gone, forgotten somewhere behind him. The younger Marine straightened instinctively, half expecting a reprimand, half waiting for whatever came next. He stopped 3 feet from Elena, the question already boiling in his throat. "Who the hell taught you that shot?" Elena looked up slowly, the heat shimmer painting ghost lines in the air between them. Her voice came quiet even. "My partner," she said. "Sergeant Marcus Hale." The name cracked through the silence harder than a rifle report. Mason blinked, stepping back without meaning to. He'd heard that name before. Everyone in the Corps had. Marcus Hale, the Marine sniper whose impossible 2-mile rescue shot in Kandahar had become legend before it was buried under classified ink. The same man reported KIA in 2011 after covering his team's evacuation under fire. The corporal's smirk vanished entirely. His mouth moved, but no sound came. At the far end of the line, the range officer, an older Marine with gray in his stubble and a chest full of service years, turned toward the commotion. He'd been watching her since the wind changed, uneasy recognition sitting somewhere behind his eyes. Now, hearing the name, he moved closer, boots crunching in the sand. He crouched beside her range bag, his hand brushing the corner of the worn metal tag still half covered in dust. He flipped it over. The words were etched in fading black, Cross and Hail. 2421 confirmed. He froze, the breath leaving his lungs in a sound somewhere between a gasp and a prayer. He looked up at her, eyes wide. "You're that Cross?" Elena didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The silence did the work for her. Every Marine on the line had heard fragments of the story, whispered over deployments, passed down in barracks like folklore. A sniper duo working beyond any posted limits. A single shot across a wind-scoured valley that saved an entire patrol pinned by Taliban fire. A team extracted because someone, somewhere, understood math and mercy better than physics ever intended. The corporal backed up a step, his earlier bravado evaporating into embarrassment. "Wait, that was you?" Elena looked down, thumb tracing the old scar along the rifle stock. "It was us," she said softly. Hale called the wind. "I just pulled the trigger." The words landed like a benediction. Lewis, the older Marine, muttered under his breath, "Kandahar rescue shot." The realization spread through the line like fire through dry grass. She's the one. Cross and Hale. They saved Bravo Company, right? No, it was Charlie Team. 2 clicks east. Didn't they call her the ghost at range 12? Every conversation dissolved into breathless silence. Mason's expression shifted from disbelief to reverence. The last time he'd heard that name was at Hale's memorial service, back when rumors swirled that his partner had never been found. And now here she was, standing in the California sun, dressed like a contractor, humbling an entire range full of Marines without raising her voice. He swallowed, throat dry. "Staff Sergeant Cross," he said finally, almost a whisper. "Ma'am, I didn't know." Elena gave a small shake of her head. "You aren't supposed to." Her tone wasn't proud. It was the opposite. Steady, resigned. The voice of someone who carried stories they didn't want written down. The wind shifted again, blowing a curtain of sand between them, and for a moment she looked almost translucent, like the air itself recognized her presence. "She wasn't here to learn from them," Lewis murmured, his voice trembling with awe. They'd just been taught by her ghost. The line of Marines stood frozen. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause. In that silence, Elena reached down, ejected the round still in the chamber, and pocketed it. She stood slowly, dusted off her pants, and slung the rifle back into its case. The motion was casual, but the respect it commanded was absolute. Mason straightened to attention without meaning to. So did Lewis. Then Nolan. Then the corporal who had mocked her. One by one, every Marine along the line came to silent attention, boots clicking softly in the sand, rifles lowered. Elena glanced up and saw the shift. "That's not necessary," she said quietly. Mason met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am, it is." The salute came unspoken. No hands raised, just a shared weight of understanding hanging in the air. She exhaled, eyes glinting with something between sorrow and grace. "He'd have liked that," she whispered. The sun slipped lower over 29 Palms, painting the range in amber light. The long plate shimmered in the distance, the perfect hole at its center glowing faintly like a metal forged from silence. No one reset it. No one dared. They left it there, a monument to a story reborn, to a name once buried under sand, and to a promise carried by the wind that still remembered her. ChatGPT said, the wind at 29 Palms had gone strangely soft, as if the desert itself was listening. The last echoes of the shot had vanished into the hills, leaving only silence and the faint hiss of heat sliding across sand. Gunnery Sergeant Mason stood there for a long moment, his jaw working but no words coming. When he finally moved, it wasn't out of protocol. It was instinct, something bone deep. He straightened, shoulders squaring, chin lifting. Then, with quiet deliberation, he brought his hand to his brow and held a salute. The sound of boots followed, rough and uneven on gravel. One after another, the Marines along the firing line came to attention. Some moved stiffly, uncertain how to stand for a legend they had just finished mocking. Others stood tall, eyes forward, faces solemn, rifles lowered, muzzles toward the earth. The laughter from earlier had been burned out of them completely. Elena rose from her kneeling position, slow and calm. She didn't return the salute, not formally. Her hands stayed at her sides, her face unreadable. The sun cut a soft line across her cheek, and for a moment her eyes looked distant, far beyond the range, somewhere halfway across the world. She didn't smile. She only nodded, her throat tight, the smallest tremor flickering in her hand before she steadied it. Mason took a step forward, voice low and raw. "Ma'am, permission to shake your hand." It wasn't ceremony anymore, it was an apology in uniform. Elena hesitated, then finally extended her hand. "Only if you promise," she said quietly, "to teach your men wind drift the right way." For the first time that day, laughter returned. Not the sharp, mocking kind, but something warmer, reverent, human. A few of the Marines even smiled through the silence that followed, like they were grateful she'd given them permission to breathe again. Mason's hand was rough and strong, his grip careful, like he was afraid to break something sacred. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "I promise." Behind them, the range flags flapped lazily in the wind, the red and white stripes snapping faintly against the pole. From where they stood, the base flag was perfectly framed against the sun, rippling with that low, whispering rustle only soldiers recognize, a sound that carries pride and grief in the same breath. One of the younger Marines, Nolan, had wandered near the small office at the end of the range. The open window caught the afternoon light, spilling it across the wall inside. He stopped mid-step, staring at a photograph hanging just above the training schedules. It was old, faded around the edges. Two people stood shoulder to shoulder in desert fatigues, helmets off, dust on their faces, smiles small but real. The placard beneath it read, "Task Force Anvil, Cross and Hail, Helmand Province 2011. The light caught the image perfectly, gleaming off the glass like a candle flame. Nolan swallowed hard, stepping back. "Gunny," he called softly. Mason turned, saw the photo, and exhaled. "Well," he murmured, "I'll be damned." The others followed his gaze. No one spoke. The desert itself seemed to hush. The same woman who'd been laughed at hours earlier was now reflected in that sunlit frame, younger, smiling beside a Marine they all knew by reputation. Hale's eyes in the photo looked alive, bright. Elena's, beside him, looked exactly the same as they did now, steady, searching, quiet. She followed their gaze and saw the photo too. Her lips parted and a thin breath escaped, almost a whisper. "He hated that picture," she said softly. Said we looked too proud for ghosts. A few Marines bowed their heads. Mason's own throat worked as he found his words. "He'd be proud now," he said. "Both of you saved men who never knew your names." Elena's voice broke slightly. "That was always the point." A gust swept through the range then, not harsh, not hot, but cool, carrying the faint scent of dry sage and dust. The flag behind them caught the wind, rising fully before it settled again. Mason turned back toward his Marines. "You see this?" he said quietly. "This is what respect looks like. You don't give it, you earn it." No one dared reply. Elena slung her rifle over her shoulder, the strap cutting across her tan shirt. She looked at each of them, the corporal, the private, the older sergeant, and finally Mason. "You're good men," she said. "Keep it that way." The corporal stepped forward awkwardly, eyes lowered. "Ma'am, I didn't know." She met his gaze. "Now you do." He nodded once, ashamed and grateful all at once. Mason gestured to the range tower. "Hold that plate," he ordered. "Nobody resets it. That's staying as is." The tower operator, watching through binoculars, replied with a quiet, "Aye, Gunny." Out on the horizon, the steel target still shimmered under the heat waves, a perfect hole dead center, sun glinting off its edge like a metal no one could touch. The Marines slowly dispersed, quiet, thoughtful, like men leaving a memorial instead of a range. A few lingered, glancing back toward her. Nolan lingered longest. "Ma'am," he said softly, "how'd you know the wind was going to settle like that?" Elena smiled faintly. "You don't ever know," she said. "You just listen until the silence tells you it's time." He nodded, not understanding completely but knowing it meant something he'd remember later. Mason stayed until the last of his men had gone. He looked at her once more, that photo of Hale still glowing behind the glass. "You know," he said, "they'll tell this story for years." "Then tell it right," she said. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She turned toward the horizon. The light had gone gold, the edges of the desert fading into violet. Her shadow stretched long across the dirt, merging with the flagpoles, like one old soldier saluting another. When she finally walked away, not a single Marine said a word. They just watched her go, the calm stride of someone who had already seen the worst the world could offer and had come out of it with her soul intact. Behind her, the flag kept fluttering in the wind. And inside the small office, sunlight still burned against that photograph. Cross and Hale. Two names that meant something once again. Every Marine on that base would remember the day the data lady showed them what real mastery looked like. She wasn't just a civilian tech rep. She was the legend who once made an impossible shot to save their own, and taught a generation how to listen when the wind speaks. 3 days passed before the envelope arrived. It was thin, official, and stamped with the gold seal of the Marine Corps Commandant's office. The mail clerk at the 29 Palms admin building handed it to her carefully, like it might explode if dropped. The return address alone drew curious glances. Nobody out here got letters from that high up the chain. Elena signed the log, tucked the envelope into her bag, and walked out into the desert sunlight without opening it. She didn't need to. She already knew what it would say. That evening, when the last echoes of gunfire had faded and the range lights flickered out one by one, she sat on the hood of her old truck and finally broke the seal. Inside was a single page on letterhead, brief and formal. It thanked her for her years of service to both the Army and the Marine Corps, recognized her contribution to the Joint Sniper Training Program, and confirmed that her 3,800-meter impact at 29 Palms would be entered into the record as the longest confirmed training range hit in Marine Corps history. At the bottom, the signature read simply, "For valor and instruction beyond measure, Semper Fidelis." She read it twice. Then she folded the letter neatly back into the envelope and set it aside on the passenger seat. She didn't frame it, didn't photograph it, didn't post it anywhere. Recognition was never the point. When dawn came, she drove north, away from the base, away from the range and its quiet awe. The highway turned to gravel, then to dirt, winding through the sparse California hills until she reached the ridge where the desert opened wide and endless. At the top stood a simple wooden stake, half buried in sand, the nameplate weathered by time and wind, Hale, M. She parked the truck, stepped out, and walked the last few feet. The desert wind pressed lightly against her back, the same kind of steady cross breeze that had whispered across their rifles years ago. She knelt in the dust. In her hand was a single brass casing, the last one she'd fired that day at the range. She turned it over between her fingers, thumb brushing the rim where the primer dented slightly inward. Her voice came quiet, carried off by the wind. "Every shot's a promise," she murmured. Every promise costs something. She placed the casing beside the nameplate, aligning it with 3 older ones she'd left over the years. Then she stayed there a while, not praying, not crying, just listening. The breeze moved through the sagebrush like a sigh. Somewhere far off, a jet roared overhead, its contrail slicing a clean white line across the morning sky. After a while, she stood. The sun was climbing now, painting the valley gold. She looked once more at Hale's name and smiled softly, the kind of smile that hides pain inside gratitude. "Still got your wind calls, right?" she whispered. "You'd have liked that." When she turned to leave, the desert was utterly still. Only her boot prints and the 4 casings marked the spot, small, shining promises left behind in the dust. Narrator's reflection. Respect isn't loud. It doesn't shout or demand applause. It's earned in quiet places. in the patience between breaths, in the steadiness of a hand that refuses to shake, in the silence after a shot that saves someone you'll never meet. Heroes like Elena Cross never ask for recognition. They carry it with them in scars, in memories, in the names carved on weathered plates halfway up forgotten hills. Every generation of soldier learns eventually that courage isn't about standing tallest, it's about standing steady when the wind shifts. It's about knowing that every action, every round, every heartbeat in the line of duty is a promise, one made not to glory, but to the people beside you. And when those promises are kept, long after the noise fades and the laughter dies, the world remembers, not in medals or headlines, but in the quiet reverence of those who were there and those who wish they had been. Respect doesn't need to echo. It only needs to endure. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These tales remind us that real courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it breathes through silence and sacrifice. Each story we tell honors the men and women who carried the weight of duty quietly, who never asked for thanks, and who showed the world that valor doesn't need a stage. It just needs a heartbeat that refuses to quit. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And to every veteran who ever picked up a rifle, stood a post, or held the line when no one was watching, we salute you.